It's good to see everyone this morning. A little sparse in the pews this morning. I know quite a number have already gone down to Fort Hill for camp, and certainly keep that group in your prayers. They'll have a safe and a good week there, and certainly I know that a lot more are going down this afternoon, so we have quite a representation there. And again, keep them in your prayers. Leave your Bibles turned to the book of 3 John. We're going to be bouncing off those opening verses there of 3 John. But before going there, and if you're following the outline that we give out, these first few points are not in there. They were done after that was printed. But you know, in studying any book of the New Testament, it's vitally important that we understand who the audience is. In other words, who is this book or this epistle being addressed to? Now, obviously, as we look at the New Testament, all of these books are addressed either to a Jewish audience, some of them are addressed to a Gentile audience, and then some are addressed to a mixture, to both a Jew and a Gentile. For example, the Gospel according to Matthew is addressed to a Jewish audience. Mark, on the other hand, is addressed to a Roman audience, or we could say a Gentile audience. The Gospel of John is known sometimes as the universal gospel, is addressed to all men. As we look at the epistles, though, we can narrow it down even more. Sometimes the epistles are addressed to very specific congregations. For example, the church at Corinth received 2 different letters from the pen of the Apostle Paul, at least 2 that we have recorded for us today. And what about the book of Ephesians? It was addressed to the church that met there in Ephesus. On the other hand, we have letters that were addressed to groups of congregations. For example, the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation was addressed, and I realize in one sense it is addressed to all men of all ages, but primarily it was addressed to the 7 churches there of Asia. The epistle to the Galatians was written, if you look at the opening verses there of Galatians chapter 2, it was written to the churches of Galatia. We would say to the congregations of the church there in Galatia. On the other hand, some epistles were written to specific individuals, especially Paul, as he penned very personal, very intimate letters, if you will, not only to the young man Titus, but he also penned letters to his son in the faith, Timothy. And the epistle of 3 John, which serves as our text this morning, is another example of a very personal letter that was addressed to an individual. But who was this epistle addressed to? Who was this letter intended for? Well, from the opening verse of 3 John, we see that this very personal letter was written to a beloved brother by the name of Gaius. Now, all of my life, I heard the name pronounced Gaius, but I've been told the correct pronunciation based upon the diacritical markings is Gaius. So if I say Gaius, it's just an old habit coming out there. But this man, Gaius, was obviously an outstanding example of what a Christian ought to be and what a Christian should be and what a Christian should do. In fact, as we read about this man in John's writing here, his spiritual well-being was a criterion, if you will, for John's desire for Gaius relative to his spiritual condition. In essence, if you look at what John is saying here, what's he say? He said, I hope you're physically doing as well. I hope your physical health is as good as your spiritual health. Now, maybe you've never thought about it, but that's a tremendous compliment. For someone to say, I hope you're doing as well physically as you are spiritually. And so that's the kind of man that we're looking here. And it seems from verse 2 of 3 John that Gaius was prospering spiritually. Notice John writes in verse 2, Beloved, I wish above all things that thou mayest prosper and be in health, even as thy soul prospers. Now, one translation, and it's really not a very good translation in most regards, but at least on this verse, I like the way it renders it here. It simply says that Gaius' soul was getting along well. How many of us could say that our souls, that our spiritual being is getting along well? And as we look at the spiritual health of Gaius, it's seen in the way that he encouraged, that he supported those who were proclaiming and teaching God's truth. Notice verse 6 there of 3 John. Actually, I want to look at verses 5 and 6 of 3 John. Beloved, thou doest faithfully whatsoever thou doest to the brethren and to strangers. which have borne witness of thy charity, we would say love, to thy witness, given witness to thy charity or love before the church, whom if thou bring forward on their journey after a godly sort, thou shalt do well. Now, I like the way the English Standard renders this passage, so I want to read it again from that particular translation. John says, Beloved, it is a faithful thing you do in all your efforts for these brethren, strangers as they are, who testify to your love before the church. You do well to send them on their journey as a manner worthy of God. Notice, not only was he helping and encouraging and supporting those who were proclaiming the truth, he was doing so to strangers. It wasn't that he was supporting the local missionary that everybody knew and loved. It wasn't that he was upholding and helping someone that he knew personally. These were strangers. People that he perhaps had never met, not personally acquainted with, and yet he was helping them. Think about it. This man Gaius, he was not a great preacher. He was not an apostle. He was not even an inspired writer of the New Testament. It doesn't appear that he ever took part in a missionary journey with Paul or others. We have no record of any inspired book or letter that he penned. We don't have a sermon recorded that he ever preached like others. But he was simply a great supporter of those who were teaching and preaching and advancing the gospel. And let me just stop here to emphasize this is just as important. Not everybody can be an Apostle Paul. Not everybody can be a great proclaimer or a great missionary. But you know what? We all can be supporters of those who do the work of God. Maybe you can't go overseas into the mission field personally, but you can be a supporter. And I don't mean just financially. We can support through our encouragement. We can support through our prayers and through other ways. That's what Gaius seems to have been, a great supporter of those who were doing the work of God. You know, by supporting those who went forth with the truth, Gaius had a little part in whatever they accomplished. In fact, look at verse 8 there. He became a fellow helper to the truth or for the truth. And if you look at the American Standard here, it says he is a fellow worker. How could he be a fellow worker and not be out in the mission field with these people? Because he was supporting them. Now, we're not told in what way he supported them or how he supported them. And that's not important. The fact is, he was a supporter of these proclaimers of truth. And in so doing, he became a fellow helper or a fellow worker with them. In the time that we have this morning, I want to briefly consider 3 points based upon this text. First and foremost, I want us to consider the importance of the truth. And then I want us to consider some possible hindrances to the truth. And there are many more than we have time to cover in just one lesson. And then finally, I want to mention a few things about those who are fellow helpers. Let's begin by looking at this focus on the truth. You know, based on the number of times that the word truth or the truth is found in Scripture, it's obviously a topic that is vitally important. It's important for any number of reasons, but if you take the time to count them, just here in this epistle, John mentions the truth at least 6 times in these 14 verses. Notice in verse 1, John says that he loved Gaius in truth. It was the truth of the gospel that had brought John and Gaius together. It was the truth of the gospel that was the bond between them. It was the truth of the gospel that had made them brethren. And if you think about it, this applies to us, does it not? Now, some obviously have physical relationships, but other than that, we are all bound together as brethren by the truth. But notice also in verse 6 here, the brethren bore witness unto the truth of this brother Gaius. You know, the truth was a powerful force in this man's life. Here was a man clearly who allowed the truth to dictate, to direct, to guide his life. And certainly that's the way it should be for all of us today. If we're truly children of God, if we truly believe that the truth is what sets us free, John 8 and verse 32, then we're going to be guided by and directed by the truth. But notice also verse 3 here. John says that Gaius walked in the truth. In other words, his life was directed by, his actions were determined by what was set forth in the truth. Gaius knew what to do. He knew how to live. He knew how to conduct himself because he was familiar with the truth. But now also notice verse 4. Again, the word truth here. In verse 4, John rejoiced to hear that his children walked in the truth. Now, you'll find some question here as to who the children are in reference here in verse 4. Some believe that the children are those that had been converted by John. Others believe that these were simply brethren that he had a very special bond, a very special love and relationship for. And it really doesn't matter. The fact is he rejoiced to hear that whoever these children were, they were walking in the truth. What does it mean to walk in the truth? To walk in truth simply means to live it. To allow the truth to determine our conduct. You remember what David the psalmist wrote back in Psalm 119 verse 105? He said, "Thy word is a light unto my feet and a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path." There are many other verses that talk about walking in the truth, directing our lives by the truth. When we walk according to godliness, when we walk according to God's word, we're walking in the truth. Now, obviously, when we get outside God's word, when we begin to follow some other standard, if you will, whether it's the standard of my conscience or my want to or the standard of the world, I'm no longer working in the truth or walking in the truth. But I'm allowing something else to determine my actions. But notice also verse 8, John encourages Gaius to be a fellow helper for the truth. We don't know a lot about Gaius as far as his abilities. We don't know a lot about his intelligence. What was he, just brilliant man, a real thinker, or was he just an average guy out here, maybe a field hand, a laborer? I don't know. But the fact that John describes him here and encourages him to be a fellow helper for the truth tells me that here was a man John knew could do it. There was something that he could do to encourage and to help, no matter what other limitations there may or may not have been in his life. And so it is with us. We can't all be an Apostle John. We can't all be the great scholars and the great proclaimers of the truth. But the fact is, we can be fellow helpers. We can be fellow laborers for the truth. Do you remember what John had declared, at least what the Lord had declared about the truth? In John 8 and verse 32, remember Jesus wrote, "And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." And the beginning in verse 33, listen to the response. They answered him, "We be Abraham's seed, and we're never in bondage to any man. How sayest thou, ye shall be made free?" And in verse 34, Jesus says, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, whosoever committeth sin is the servant of sin." Now, I've always found this passage to be not only arrogant but humorous, because they said, we're descendants of Abraham. We've never been in bondage to any man. Excuse me, had they forgotten? They'd been in bondage over and over and over, going all the way back to the time they were in Egypt when God delivered them. They were conquered by their enemies over and over during the period of the Judges and during this time in which Jesus was there talking to them. They were not a free nation. They were not a self-governing people. They were in bondage to Rome. And yet they had the nerve to say, we were never in bondage to any man. But Jesus wasn't talking about their bondage to Rome, or prior to that to the Greeks, or the Babylonians, or the Medo-Persians. Jesus is talking about their bondage, their slavery to sin, their bondage to Satan. And that's why he says, whosoever committeth sin is the servant. And that word servant is not talking about like a hired servant, literally the bond servant, the slave of sin. Remember what Jesus said in John 17:17. He said sanctification comes through the truth. Notice, sanctify them through thy truth. Thy word is truth. If you want to know what the truth is, you got to go to the source. You've got to go to the origin of truth as it's given by God, and that's simply in the Scriptures. And over as we read the writings of the New Testament, the apostles emphasize the importance of truth. Remember, Peter said that the soul is purified in obeying the truth, 1 Peter chapter 1. He said, seeing ye have purified your souls in obeying the truth. Now that's very clear, it's very concise. Paul talks about the enlightening and transforming power of the truth in Ephesians 4. Now today in our society it's become very popular in the educational circles to say, well, what is truth? Who knows what truth is? Truth is relative. Truth changes with the time. No, truth is always truth. Just like right is always right and wrong is always wrong. If there is no absolute standard of truth, if there is no objective truth, as some would have us to believe, then all of these statements, all of these scriptures that talk about truth, the importance of truth, following the truth, walking in the truth, being set free by the truth, they're false. They mean absolutely nothing, because you see, what might be truth to me may not be truth to you. What I consider to be truth, you might consider to be hilarious, to be humorous. No, beloved, there is an absolute standard of truth. It's very important, just as it was during the time this epistle was written. And so surely we can see why Gaius was involved in helping spread the truth, because it was a very vital part of his life. And he knew how important it was that it be a part of others' lives. And when we are blessed, or when we accept the fact that we are blessed by the truth, when we realize the importance of truth, we, like Gaius, are going to want to be supportive of it. We're going to tell people about the truth. We're going to help support those who are spreading the truth. But now let's move on and consider how some things can hinder the truth. How do we face hindrances to the truth? And if you've been a Christian very long at all, if you've been trying to live the Christian life, you know there are a lot of hindrances in your life. Not only hindrances from outside in the world, there may be hindrances from your family who are not Christians. And sometimes we are our own greatest hindrance, are we not? Sometimes we allow things like pride and arrogance to become a hindrance to us, to walking in the truth. Notice in Romans 1 and verse 2, we're not going to take the time to read it, but Paul in the Roman letter talked about those who were allowing the truth to be hindered. Those who were causing the truth to be hindered. And he was talking about the Jews and Gentiles here. And he rebukes them because they were being a hindrance there. God wants people to have access to the truth so that they can be free from slavery, so they can be released from the shame and the penalty of sin. He wants them to have the truth so they can be purified, so they can be sanctified. And yet, unrighteousness still hinders and holds back God's truth. In fact, Romans chapter 1, if you look at verse 28 and following there, we read of those who are filled with all unrighteousness. Beloved, you can't be filled with truth and unrighteousness. It's either or. It's either a glass is filled with clear, pure water, or is filled with dirty water, contaminated water. You can't have a glass with both in it. Oh, they may both have started out pure and contaminated. But when you pour them together into that glass, you have contaminated water. And so it is. You may have the truth as a child of God. You may have been walking in the truth. But if you allow your life to be filled with contamination, with that which is filthy, with that which is vile in the sight of God, then our lives are vile and ungodly. And oftentimes unrighteousness does captivate the minds of people. We sometimes try to excuse, well, it's just a little thing. It's not really going to affect me. It's not going to hurt my Christian life. I can still be godly and engage in whatever the behavior may be. And yet how soon we find out that our minds can be captivated. Unrighteousness can stimulate wrong thoughts, wrong desires, and ultimately lead to wrong actions. All what started out as what we say is a small thing, something that's insignificant, something that's not that big a deal, but in time it becomes a big deal. And how many people have been led completely away from Christ because they have been deceived by unrighteousness, because they have become hardened to sin, thinking that it was such a little thing. And maybe in the beginning it was small, but that little seed of ungodliness can grow to a mighty tree. As Christians, the way that we live, the way that we conduct our lives is either helping the truth or it's hindering the truth. Think about it. We have co-workers, we have family, we have children, we have our church family, people who are looking at us, people who are examining our lives, especially people in the world, to see if we're really what we claim to be, to see if we are practicing what we preach, or if, as some people often accuse us, you're just hypocrites. You talk the talk, but you don't walk the walk. You don't practice what you preach. You know, the Galatian saints had become so hindered that they were not obeying the truth anymore. And Paul rebukes them there in Galatians 5 and verse 7. He begins by saying, ye did, past tense, ye did run well. Talking about the Christian life. Ye did run well. Who did hinder you that ye should not obey the truth? Something or someone had pulled them away. And if you read elsewhere in Galatians 1, beginning in verse 6, we find who it was. They'd allowed false teachers to pull them away. Notice, I marvel that ye are so soon removed from him that called you unto the grace of Christ unto another gospel, which is not another, but there be some that trouble you and would pervert the gospel of Christ. But though we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel unto you than that which we have preached unto you, let him be accursed. Or as one translation says, let him be an anathema. But let him be accursed. As we said before, so say I now again, if any man preach any other gospel unto you than that ye have received, let him be accursed. And then toward the close of the book in Galatians 5, verse 4 and 6, Paul, in very strong language here, very stern warning, says this: Christ is become of no effect unto you. Whosoever of you would be justified by the law, ye are fallen from grace. In other words, some of these false teachers had come in and said, hey, you got to follow the law of Moses. And some of these Galatians had actually turned from Christ back to Moses. They turned back to the law of Moses. And he says, in so doing, you've cut yourself off. You have been severed from Christ and fallen from grace. In verse 5, for we through the Spirit wait for the hope of righteousness by faith. For in Jesus Christ neither circumcision availeth anything, nor uncircumcision, but faith working by love. Not the law of circumcision, not the law of Moses. These false teachers had led them astray. And it's still true today that false teaching will hinder, it will discourage, it will confuse people. And eventually it will cause many to be lost. False teachers speak evil of the way, Peter says in 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 2. And the truth today is hindered by so many things in the world. And ultimately it all comes from Satan, I understand. But Satan uses many things. For example, the doctrine of faith only. How many people in the world are preaching and teaching and believing that all you've got to do is believe? You know, the current terminology you often hear is just accept Christ as your personal Savior. Well, faith is important. In fact, without faith, the Hebrew writer says it's impossible to please God. But faith only doesn't save, never has, never will. James 2 and verse 24. You see that now that by works a man is justified and not by faith only. And this doctrine denies so many passages of Scripture, such as Mark 16:16, that baptism saves. This idea totally contradicts any number of Scriptures that we could talk about. The current idea that one church is as good as another is another false doctrine that seeks to destroy the church. Those who believe that one church is just as good as another, that any church will do, deny the fact that the church is the bride of Christ. They do not believe that the church is the blood-bought institution, the family of God. Over and over, the Bible talks about the uniqueness, the oneness of the church. Ephesians 4 and verse 4, Colossians 1 and verse 18. There is one body. There is one church. And that's the only church in which salvation can or will be found. And on the examples go. We look around us today and there's so many false doctrines leading people away from the truth. And again, how do we deal with these? How do we face these? With the truth. We can't defeat false doctrine with our own logic, with our own rationing, or our own rationale. We've got to go back to the truth, just as Jesus did when he was tempted by Satan in the wilderness. What did Jesus do in answering Satan? It is written. He quoted Scripture. And so if we want to defeat those who would attack the truth and deny the truth, we've got to go back to the Scriptures. But finally, just quickly, I want to mention those who faithfully help the truth, faithful helpers of the truth. You know, assisting those who spread the truth, as I mentioned in the introduction, is indirect involvement in spreading the truth. You know, Gaius is encouraged to assist and to support those who were spreading the truth. And it would seem that he was already doing this. He was already involved in this. In fact, in Galatians 6 and verse 6, Paul says those who are taught, those who have been taught, have a responsibility to support those who were teaching. Listen to what he says. Let him that is taught in the word communicate. We would say provide for. But let him that is taught in the word communicate unto him that teacheth in all good things. An important way of supporting the truth. You know, supporting those who go and preach the lost, especially those in the mission field, is a way of showing our concern for the lost. Again, not everyone can pack up and go to a foreign country. We can all support those who are involved in spreading the gospel to other lands. And men who support and preach the gospel are deserving of support. Those in the mission field, how many times, do we see missionaries forced to come home because they can't raise support, because they don't have the funds? I had a missionary tell me that he'd lost a large contribution, a monthly contribution from a congregation, and they cut it off immediately, and they said, we've got to repave our parking lot. Brethren, I don't know about you, but I would be ashamed to stand before God in the judgment as an elder and say, well, we had to cut out mission work so we could pave our parking lot. Surely there are other areas that could have been cut back. But you see, they were not helping the spread of the truth. They were hindering the spread of the truth. One can consider the blessings that come from proclaiming the gospel. We look at the work, and this congregation supports several good works. The work in Costa Rica, the work in India, the work in, well, I drew a blank, where Chris and Trevor are. But we support several good works around the world, and we can take pride in the fact that we have a part in that. And especially in Costa Rica, because our young people go, they're involved in this personally, along with some of our adult members. And we need to support these works, not only financially as we do, but we can support them through our prayers, through letters of encouragement, and letting them know that, hey, we're behind you. That's what Gaius seemingly was doing. Seeming of the truth was a very vital part of Gaius' life. He not only lived the truth, but the truth lived in him. He was a fellow worker. He was a supporter of the truth. And that's what we need to aim to be in our Christian life, brethren. We need to love the truth. We need to live the truth. We need to support the truth in every way that we can. That's what God would have us to do. This morning, if you're not a supporter of the truth, you need to be. Perhaps you're a child of God and you've just been drifting along. You've not really been involved in supporting the truth. And I don't mean just financially, other ways. You need to make that right. Or perhaps you're not a child of God. You've never become a Christian. You can come in faith, repenting and turning from your sins, confessing the name of Christ and being baptized for the forgiveness of your sins. If you're subject to this invitation of Christ, if you need to respond in any way, well, let us help you. Will you come while we stand and we sing?